Welcome to Sabes Que. Did you know? I'm your host, Jesse BERMUDEZ on Usala Media. My co-host, Pablo Bautista. Pablo and I are excited. Our guest today is an artist from the West Coast, San Francisco Bay Area, who has performed in Philly at the International House, The Painted Bride, and did workshops with our students and teachers at AMLA. He was also part of the first Northeastern Latino tour created by Pregones in New York, AMLA in Philly, and Inquilinos en Boricua in Boston. He's a percussionist, a composer, arranger, band leader of Machete Ensemble, and he's also a 5-time Grammy nominee. Besides that, he's a historian. Welcome to Sabes Que. Did you know? Mr. John Santos.
Yeah.
All right.
Welcome, John.
Thank you, gentlemen. What a pleasure. What an honor to be up here with you both, Pablo and Jesse. You know, the utmost respect that I have for both of you. Thank you very much. I have one question to start things off.
Go ahead.
What was that theme music?
That was a new recording that Pablo is doing.
I had a feeling it might have been Pablo.
It's the beginning of Watermelon Man that he's redoing.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah.
I was going to say, whoever that conga drummer is knows what's up.
Yeah.
Well, John, you know,
a little bit.
yeah, every now and then, right? Well, you know, John, let's go all the way to the beginning, you know, on this interview, where you were born and how, you know, you came up, how you were raised, you know. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay, well, you know, in a nutshell, I was born in San Francisco, as were my parents, both born in San Francisco, California. And my dad's family is from Cabo Verde, which are islands off the coast of Senegal in West Africa that used to be colonies of Portugal. So my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was born there and spoke Portuguese. First was his first language. He came here as a young man. I think he was maybe still a teenager when he came here. And like most of the Cape Verdeans, he came to the East Coast. He was in New Bedford and Hartford area, and then came out this way early on. So that was that side. And my mother's side was Puerto Rican, is Puerto Rican. And that's the culture that I identify with most, mainly because that side of my family is huge. And my dad's side, unfortunately, you know, my Cape Verdean grandma, my uncle, my aunt, they all passed before I was born. So the only one I knew was my grandfather. But he left a big impression on me because he was a professional musician. He played accordion and guitar. And so for the first 10 years of my life, I spent a lot of time with him. And I just remember distinctly like it was yesterday being in his kitchen. You know, they would hang out in the kitchen and cooking that Creole food, and all of his partners were musicians. They would play that beautiful Cape Verdean music in his kitchen while they were cooking that food, and that's an indelible memory. Then I had the same one on the Puerto Rican side, but the difference being that on the Puerto Rican side, I had hundreds of uncles and aunts and cousins and great uncles and great aunts, and it was musicians. You know, my grandma was married 3 times, and 2 of them were professional musicians. So I got my start playing in my Puerto Rican grandfather's band when I was about 11, 12 years old in the mid-'60s. And that got the ball rolling. So I grew up in that real Puerto Rican culture, real strong. And, you know, I just will say, you know, in closing you know, that intro that, you know, the culture is so strong. You know, our identity as Puerto Ricans was really strong, even though we had never been to Puerto Rico. You know, we were born and raised here. My parents were born and raised here. My Puerto Rican grandmother, whom we got all of our identity as Puerto Ricans from her in her house with the typical food and the music every weekend and dancing and just incredible Puerto Rican culture in her place. Well, she was born in Hawaii. So it was my great-grandparents who actually left the island of Puerto Rico in 1901 and went to Hawaii. They were part of a migration of about 5,000 people. My grandma had not been to Puerto Rico. Check this out. In 1989, I was on an airplane with my grandma and my mom going to Puerto Rico, I mean, to be with my sister who was there about to give birth to her son. And on the airplane, I discovered in 1989. Now, my grandma was born in 1908, and in 1989, I found out that was her first time going to Puerto Rico, and that floored me. I would have sworn that she'd been there a million times, because I had been there, several times. And my grandma was the most Puerto Rican person I ever met, but she only was there one time in her life on that trip that we went for a couple of weeks to Puerto Rico and came back. She would always go back to Hawaii. That's where her people were, the Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. Every year she'd go back to Hawaii, but she had never been to Puerto Rico. So, the cultura is just so powerful, so strong. What I learned about food and about our history and about the language came through that connection.
Wow. Amazing.
That's
amazing.
eclectic, yeah. I can relate to a lot of that stuff. So, John, let me ask you a question. So, like, when you started working with your grandfather, you said, how did you get introduced to the conga and the actual mechanics of playing the marcha, tumbao, learning clave? Was there some kind of structure or infrastructure in the San Francisco area that was helping young people with the musical journeys, like our Latin musical journey? Was there teachers back then, or how did you pick it up and stuff? How did that happen?
Well, there were really no teachers per se. You had to learn, on the job training in la calle. That was the deal. Especially because our Latino community here in the Bay Area is not Caribeño. It's Mexicano, Central American, and the culture is very different. So, the information is not easy to come by the way it would be, more easy on the East Coast. So we, in my case, I had played some music. I played clarinet actually, third grade to the sixth grade. I played some clarinet, but the conga drum I started with my grandfather's band, and it was the members of his band that took me under their wing. When they see a person that young who has some interest, they open their arms and start sharing stuff with me. Nice. And so there was some percussionists in his group. One of them was a gentleman named Marcos Castillo. He was a ponceño from Puerto Rico. He played timbal and bongo. And so I was sitting next to him playing conga, and he'd be giving me tips and telling me what's up and, the whole time. And then there were a couple of others too, Richie Giraldes, who actually wrote a composition for the Gran Combo. He was a percussionist out here. And Kike, there was a couple guys that played at different times with my grandfather. Then my dad knew another Puerto Rican dude named Rene Rivera, who was a merchant marine. He used to ship out. And he gave me my first formal lesson. He gave me one lesson on conga about the tumbao, which you're talking about, the marcha, about how to play the tumbao, a little bit, how to get some sounds. And then he shipped out. And when our plan was to get back together and I would be his student. But he ended up getting killed on the ship, unfortunately, on that trip. So I never saw him again. I had that one lesson, and then being trial by fire in my grandfather's band, they would get you straight, tell you, just play straight, play time. You'd be trying to play licks and stuff. They said, no.
Yeah, that's great. What a great story. It's
wow. The folks on this side pretty much know what's going on this side. What's going on a little bit over there in the music scene, Latin music scene, where you're at?
Well, the Latin music scene is deep here. As far as the Caribbean-based music, the Cuban-based music, that has a history here going back at least to the 40s. The big bands, especially like the recordings of the bands in the 40s and the 50s. Of Machito, Tito Rodriguez, Tito Puente, Perez Prado, all that stuff was very popular. So even among the Central American and Mexican audiences here. So there were some big bands that cropped up here modeled after those bands that usually were led by Mexican band leaders and had, a mixture of musicians from all over in the bands. So there was that scene. And then there was a big jazz scene. The jazz scene was, all the groups would tour here. All the great jazz bands and those bands I just named would tour. San Francisco was a destination for their tours. So my parents were big fans of all of that music, had great record collections. Also, my grandparents, my uncles had great jazz record collections and were very much into swing dancing and all of that. Then you had, Cal Jader Band was formed here in 1954. And the guys who were in that original band, most of them went to junior high and high school with my dad. So he knew all them cats. There were three brothers, Manny Duran on piano, Carlos Duran on bass, and Eddie Duran played off and on with Cal on guitar. And then he had Rosales, Edgar Rosales was playing conga, and Benny Velarde, un panameño, was playing bongo and timbal. And my dad knew all them cats. Plus Carlos Federico, another really excellent arranger and piano player from Panama, who he used to do the arrangements of Armando Peraza's tunes that George Shearing recorded throughout the 50s. The arrangements were done by this piano player, Carlos Federico. And my dad knew all them cats from when they were kids. So a little bit later, because I was born in 1955, but in the 60s, when I started playing in the mid and the late 60s, my dad would take me around to all of their gigs. By that time, they were not with Cal anymore, but they all had their own gigs around town in bars and restaurants and what have you. And at that time, it was no big deal to bring a kid into a bar as long as I'm drinking my Shirley Temples, not trying to act up. And so I'd be hanging out with those cats, and they would let me sit in. And so that was a big deal for me. And then the last part for me is, not the last part, but an important part, is the Puerto Rican community, because it was small but mighty. The Puerto Rican community goes back a long time here. I don't know if you're aware that the oldest Puerto Rican social club in this country is the San Francisco Club Puertorriqueño that was formed in 1912. And then so there's that element. And then, in the Puerto Rican community, there was always music. There was always music for everything. Every occasion there was music. And I remember going to the Puerto Rican club, of course, since my earliest memories. Would go there for all kinds of occasions and bring people from Puerto Rico, a lot of Jibaro music in my grandma's house as well. All those records, of course, Ramito, La Calandria, Chuito, Batasa Carrero, all that stuff. They that was like a soundtrack for my childhood, because they were playing that stuff. There was either live music or those records playing 24/7 in my grandparents' house. And in my parents' house, there was the more contemporary stuff, the Latin jazz, Tito Puente, and the jazz stuff. My dad liked all that jazz stuff, Nat King Cole, and the swing era stuff. So nothing but music, And then the Latin rock scene was really born here, in the mid '60s. Santana, another connection. Santana, who was about 7 years older than me, the same age as my older brothers and my older cousins. They all went to school together at Mission High School, the same high school that my dad and all them other cats I mentioned went to. So in the barrio, Carlos, they were talking about Carlos before his first record came out. His first record came out in 1968, Santana. Oh. And they were talking about him before his record came out, saying, hey, there's this guitar player, he's got congas and timbales, and we knew what those instruments were. So when that Santana thing hit, boy, whoo, it was on. That gave a whole nother legitimacy to those old traditional instruments of my grandparents. Right. So that was the environment, for me, like a lot of music all around.
Mm. So John, let me ask you a question. So you're talking, you brought us all the way up to the 60s. Mm-hmm. And you were in the San Francisco area. So at that time, there was a lot of civil unrest. There's a lot of stuff going on. The Black Panthers was going on at that time, Martin Luther King, all of that. Did that affect you in the music and your upbringing musically coming up? Because I know it's pretty eclectic, and I just was wondering, because that was a pretty interesting time.
Yeah, it affected me profoundly, and I was young, because so like 1965, I was only 10 years old, so I wasn't, an activist, quote unquote, but I was seeing all that stuff on TV. My older brothers were all, aware of what was going on, and they were listening to a lot of hip music, all the music, all the rock and roll and funk and stuff that was, a reaction, and the young people speaking up, for civil rights and against the war, all that stuff. That was very much in our face. You know, we had to deal with that. I actually had a draft number. If that Vietnam War went a little bit longer, I would have been drafted because I had a number.
Wow.
But it ended just in time for me to not get the call. So when all that stuff was going down, you know, we had cousins and friends of our older brothers and cousins who went to Vietnam, and we were, you know, my older brothers were out in the street doing some protesting and stuff, but I didn't. I was too young to do that. However, that stuck in my head, you know, and seeing those images of what they were doing to the demonstrators in the South and all that stuff really did affect me. So that a few short years later, by 1970 and then throughout the 70s, it really set my path as to making the connection between art and activism and the solidarity between all of those struggles that we were facing. And that was a big part of the scene here. You know, at that same time, in the mid 70s, then the Mission Cultural Center opened up, La Peña Cultural Center opened up, and there was all the solidarity among the Latinos. You know, there were a lot of Chilenos and Argentinos, you know, people who were very much involved, and Salvadoreños and Nicaraguenses involved in the freedom struggles and the dictatorship problems that were going on in their countries. And that was all in part of our mission district mezcla. You know, we had all that, and there was solidarity. So it was not, you know, everybody was coming together and bringing poetry and music and speaking up in these cultural centers. And the cultural centers opened their doors to us, to the young people like my age, you know, 18, 19, 20, to come in and do what we wanted to do. And we would, you know, do music and do events inspired by or raising money for the organizations that were raising consciousness about those struggles. So it definitely had a strong impact on me.
Wow. That's awesome. Thank
Amazing.
you.
Amazing. You know what, John, I just wanted to mention this. A good friend of yours, may he rest in peace, Bobby Mattheus. I was with him in California when the funeral for Chavez was happening. And actually, Bobby was a wonderful guy. He looked out after me and made sure that I would get home, you know, catch my plane and all that kind of stuff. I just thought I'd mention that because I know you did some work with Bobby.
Yeah, he's a good, yeah, man. He's a good friend, good brother. Like you said, he was a good brother, very much an activist and a warrior for the music, speaking up for the music. He was, you know, he was an older brother for me. I think he was about 15 years older than me, if I remember correctly. But we had a good time. You know, I would hang out with him in LA, and he'd do the same when he come up this way. And then we did that one project together called Mambo Jazz on the Kubop label, which was his band and my band, because my band had a gig in LA. His band was based in LA. And he came up with the idea because we were both with the Kubop label. And he said, he proposed it to them and they went ahead with it. And it was basically his whole band and my whole band in the studio. And we recorded the whole record in one day. It was really fun. And they mixed it the next day, and it was cool. It's a very spontaneous record, and we had a lot of fun with it. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. You know, speaking of, you know, people rest in peace too. I wanted to mention the name of a good brother, a great friend of ours who just passed yesterday. One of the greatest bass players in jazz, who's been based in the Bay Area for many years, by the name of Jeff Chambers. A close brother for me. I mean, an incredible musician and brother. We did countless gigs together over the years, and he just passed, unfortunately, due to cancer. He's exactly the same age as me. He's born in 1955. But I mean, he played with a who's who. I started to make a list of the people he's played with to give you an idea of the kind of musician this brother was. He played with Dizzy Gillespie, Moody, with James Moody, Joe Henderson, Frank Morgan, Hank Crawford, Tommy Flanagan, Cedar Walton, Tony Williams, Don Cherry, Freddie Hubbard, Bobby Hutcherson, Kenny Burrell, Ahmad Jamal, Pharoah Sanders, George Coleman, Gonzalo Rubalcaba, Buddy Montgomery, Charlie Rouse, Eddie Harris, Eddie Marshall, and on and on and on. Anytime anybody would come to town, he's the first call that they would get to put a band together. So the brother was just, you know, it's a huge loss for the musical community here, and we're very shaken by it. It just happened yesterday.
Oh my God, may he rest in peace.
Yeah.
So sad, man, to hear that, you know. John, there was something that I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because I've heard you at times talk about the drum, the essence of the importance of the drum and how it's tied into our Caribbean world. You know, can you articulate a little bit on that? Because I think folks need to, for once and for all, understand the drum and what it means to us.
That's a thesis and a dissertation, but but I understand. I appreciate that question. I understand what you're getting at, and I do have the 2-minute version, so I'll give you that.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Cool.
The drum is the center of our community, and that's going back to African tradition, that the drum is at the center. But also in indigenous cultures here throughout the Americas, the drum is in the center. And it's because the drum has a very important connection to our ancestors and to the earth. The fact that the drum is made out of wood and animal skin, and you put your spirit into it. It has spirit from those things that were alive, and you bring your spirit to it. The drum is communication with the ancestors, and it has a very spiritual connection to our communities. Now, the drum also is a powerful means of communication. And so during colonial times, when Africans were stolen from the continent and brought here forcibly during that very dark period of human history, it was known that the drum is a means of communication. So the drum was banned, and the drums, everything that the drum represents, which is centuries of African wisdom, of the medicinal use of herbs, of the magical part of the drum, and the power of bringing the community together in a circle to celebrate, to dance, to bring the presence of the ancestors into the space. The drum facilitates all of that. So because the drum was outlawed, the Africans were incredibly courageous and creative in not allowing, because they also understood the importance of the drum, of course, and they did not allow it to be extricated from their minds or their hearts or their community. And they continued to practice all the tradition around the drum, even clandestinely and even without the drum, by just the imagination, with song and with body percussion and singing percussive parts. But then on the occasions when they could, creating drums in the new space where they were at. And then the drum rose again like a phoenix out of the ashes and became once again the center of the community. Although now not just a specific African community, but a community of people of conscience, of mulattoes, of people who, trigueños, people who were, because of the violence of colonialism, who are mixed race now, but the drum still now is vital for us. We still have this stigma with the drum of being black magic and evil, and the ancient religious practices that are associated with it. But those associations were totally stigmatized by Western ignorance and Western misunderstanding. So we still have the same issues with the drum. The drum is still outlawed largely. You could still get arrested playing in a public space, playing a drum in a public space. But you notice that the drum has come full circle and is just so powerful. The drum has this power. When the drum is right, when the drum is on, you can't help but to move and be moved. It moves every molecule of your body. The drum accompanies songs that communicate again with the universe. It's international, and you don't have to speak a certain language. When you hear that drum and you feel that drum, it's going to bring you appreciation of the journey of that drum and all that people sacrifice that we could still have that drum and have that rhythm. And nowadays it has the extra thing of how we're turning into robots. Everything's computerized and chips, and it's not about natural rhythm or the environment or the earth and all the respect for the natural universe that the drum represents. So the drum has this extra thing of representing the antidote to the negative aspects of technology, the part that like when the electricity goes out and the computers don't run no more, we're back to the drum, and we're back to the basics of coming together and respecting each other in our community.
John, I couldn't ask for any better answer than that, my brother. Fantastic.
So John, let me ask a little an attachment to that. So since you see that, and you made the analogy of, in the box in the computer, because I'm playing pop music, and that's a very much a big part of my reality, is knowing what to do when, and how to sprinkle things in there but not be too folkloric or too authentic, but be able to rock within the parts. And so I can totally relate to what you're saying. Do you see a resurgence in the drum coming back because of the takeover of Pro Tools and music in the box, so to speak?
Yes and no, because definitely it has given new life in certain ways and new possibilities, opened up some roads for sure. But on the other hand, I'm discouraged by the cell phone culture that our kids have. And I see young people, and I'm talking about in this house where I live, starting here, but I see it in general, how young people reject. They don't, their culture is the phone. Their culture is TikTok and sending text messages and all that stuff, and posing in front of the phone and having the phone in their hand 24/7, which is horrible for the development of their brains, horrible for communicating on a human level. And so, I see, young people of color, kids who reject all of that, all those millennium of wisdom and history and culture and bomba and plena, rumba, all that stuff. They reject that. They're not, even though they came up around it, like my kids, my kids have grown up in the thick of it, in a community of artists and nothing but music and nothing but hip traditional stuff. And I think precisely because the way this culture is wired, and the billions that have been spent to hack their brains, that's what we're up against. And they've been successful in making the kids, turning them into consumers, where the kids just want to know the latest programs and want to dismiss everything, even get up off the dinner table to get back to the phone. So that part, that's a battle that is far from being won. I don't see that as, oh yeah, that's no problem, we're going to get over that. That's a big problem. So our work is definitely cut out for us in terms of trying to express the importance of these traditions and what the drum represents to everybody, but especially to the young people. Because if the young people ain't with it, it's gone. Within a generation or two, it'll be gone.
Yeah, it's scary.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a small break, and then we're going to come back to Sabes Que. Did you know, with Mr. John Santos. You're here on Sabes Que. Did you know? I'm your host, Jesse BERMUDEZ, and my co-host, Pablo Bautista, and we're talking to none other than John Santos.
Hey, man. Can I, before you ask me one more question, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to expound just a tiny bit more on the last question that we dealt with, because.
Good.
Because I left it on a doomsday note, we're up against technology, and it's a losing battle. But on the other hand, I'm encouraged by what I see, like, for example, in Puerto Rico in the last 20 years, how the bomba en plena have just blown up with the young people. the young, yeah, and so you have like in restaurants, like we're instead of having a DJ, a bombazo or a plenazo, and man, that's encouraging how the bomba and
That's
plena
amazing.
have taken root with the new generations and gotten new life, and the same thing has happened with the rumba in Cuba, where anywhere around the world people are studying that, and so that's encouraging, but
Mhm.
we're up against a formidable foe, and that's the point I wanted to make. Cool.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
good. Then, so now a little bit about if you were talking to some young people and to try to encourage them to get into the music or learn about the music, could that be done now, or is there a way that it's done? Have they left the music totally?
It can be done, but it's not high on their priority list, and it's not high on their radar. Most kids don't have access. It's not commercial. It's not on their phones. I mean, it is if you know how to dig for it and you want to dig for it. But what I mean, it's like if you Google something or whatever, what they're going to see is a trillion other things before a bomba or a rumba or salsa or a
Hmm.
song comes across their radar. So they have to be directed to it, and so making the information available to them and present and getting it's important to have that online presence and to be part of that, have that be part of the solution. It's a great tool, but the computer and the phone, they're powerful tools, and part of the problem is putting a tool that powerful in the hands of a child, I think, is inappropriate. I think it's
You're right.
problematic for the kids to have that kind of power. There's a lot of problems come to it, and it's much easier for them to get to the problematic stuff than to the hip stuff. So
Yeah.
it's a daunting task, but we need to be making programs and putting stuff online and getting the word out. So it's possible, but more and more the elder generations, what happens, we die off, we have our time, and then we're gone,
Hmm.
and hopefully we made enough of an influence on enough young people that it pays forward, and that more than one person will pick up the mantle, and hopefully it increases exponentially. That's the idea. But a lot of things we've already lost that we don't even know, but we've lost that traditional things that just did not, that got snuffed out because the people who carried those traditions were gone before it was able to continue. So we don't want that to happen. We have to change, we have to bend, we have to be flexible, and the work that Pablo and other artists do, making a fusion and using all these beautiful roots, because they blend beautifully, they go beautiful, they inform the pop music. The roots of pop music lie with folkloric and traditional forms, whether we're talking about the blues or we're talking about rhythmic concepts that go into
The
funk
clave.
and hip hop.
Yeah.
Yeah, clave is all over the place. Clave. If you understand clave, you could do all kind of hip stuff, which you could hear when you hear certain arrangements of pop music and hip hop. You could tell that somebody knows what's up with the clave or not, and when they do, it swings twice as hard.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, I guess
So John,
that's what Pablo, right?
yeah, well, I mean, I mean, I study hard just like John has. So John, which is a good segue because, so academically, I know that, and Jesse knows that you're considered by the world as an expert musicologist in our music, and it fascinates me to hear you mention all these dates and all the names and all the traditional, all the cats that came and influenced your life. That for me is so awesome. But what people don't, I want you to talk about like your education. Are you actually, now everybody knows, like I want the world to know that you're a music ethnologist. You're well known and well received in Washington by the Smithsonian Institute. Is that correct? Is that correct?
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And so, do you, on your everyday, are you currently teaching and formally presenting your all your research and all your work and all your record? I mean, I know you're a full-time musician, you kill it and everything, but your academic expertise is amazing. And so do you do that as well in the Bay Area? teach and
Yeah, man. Thank you for that question. First of all, I have to say I'm not formally an ethnomusicologist. I have no degree. I'm not an academic. I've never, I have a high school education and that's it. But I was in the right place at the right time to learn from the elders, and when I had that opportunity, I took advantage of it, and I was able to, hang out with the elders, and everybody has their own path. I recommend highly to people to young people to get an education, a formal education as best you can, to facilitate whatever you want to do. But I'm not a great example of that, because when I when I graduated from high school, I went to City College, and I didn't even finish. I quit. I didn't even go to the finals week. I did one semester, and when the finals came up, I wasn't ready for it, and I said I'm not. I can't do it, because at the time I had a band and I was doing a bunch of other stuff, but I also had to make the decision because I had the opportunity to work with a lot of elders. And if I was going to school, that's a hard decision for a lot of students. When you're going to go to school, or you're going to work with these great artists that you have an opportunity to do it, and that's a tough decision. If you could stick the school out, that's really the most important thing to do. But my particular path, I went the other way, but I ended up, hanging out and playing with elders, and I learned a great deal from those elders. Right. So I got to spend time with Armando Peraza, with Francisco Aguabella, with Cachao, with Tito Puente, with Max Roach, with Dizzy, and just being around those folks and having conversations and hearing their stories. That's priceless. That's an education unto itself.
Absolutely.
And that got it rolling for me. Now, what I mentioned earlier, that the Latino community here is not Caribeño. So by the time I was while I was still in high school, I had the beginnings of this collection that you see behind me. I had this, pretty incredible collection of music, because starting when I was about 11, all the elders around me, knowing that I was interested, started bringing me stuff, started turning me on to records. When they would travel, they would bring me back tapes, reel to reel, cassette, books and literature and stuff. And so by the time I was coming out of high school, I had an amazing collection of stuff, and I really recognized it as a resource. And I was asked to start making presentations, educational presentations, before I got out of high school. I did that at Mission High School, and I did that at the Mission Branch Library here in the barrio, the library. They asked me to make a presentation. So I really enjoyed that. I got to prepare. I got to dig into my resources and prepare to do a presentation. And I told the people there, if you have any questions, if I don't have the answer, I'll dig into it. I'll get it for you, because I have resources, and I have this stuff, and I have elders I could ask. In the 70s, I met Rene Lopez, the great musicologist from New York City, who produced and reissued all that incredible body of music. He was a major teacher for me, and I met him in the mid 70s. And we became friends. I brought him out to San Francisco in 1978 to do some lectures, and he was my mentor and my idol. I really patterned my lectures after the way that he did his. And then the same with Professor Robert Ferris Thompson from Yale, who's an incredible academic and knowledgeable person about African art, all African art from Central and Western.
Flash of the Spirit, didn't he?
And
yeah,
that book,
Flash of the Spirit.
Yes, indeed. He's the author of many books. And we became close friends, because I did some liner notes for Folkways records, for a record called The Cuban Danzón, Its Ancestors and Descendants. That started in 1978, 79. And when that came out, about 1981, Robert Ferris Thompson, he uses that record in his class. And he told me, when I met him a few years later, he said, you the guy who wrote those notes? He goes, man, I thought you were my age, because he was a lot older than me. But, I guess I had information, and I love, sharing it. And so teaching became something I was excited to do, because I've always said, I realized it from that point, I've always said to this day, in those situations, the person who learns the most is the teacher, because, you have to prepare. you got to dig in and come up with stuff and be able to answer questions. And over the years, with experience teaching, you start getting all these questions that makes you dig back and get the answers to them. So that's been a big part of my formation, is the act of teaching. It's been something I've done since the early 70s, and I really appreciate it.
And you're great at it. You're very articulate. I love
Yes,
listening.
yes, you are.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So listen, I want a picture to come up because I want folks to see you back in your heyday. And then we're going to come back because we're going to continue this conversation. Can you put up that picture? Talk about that, John.
All right. So, in the 70s, I played mostly timbales in the 70s in terms of band stuff because, there was not a ton of timbaleros around. And because I had been studying traditional Cuban music, I was coming at it from the perspective of the danzón, which is where the timbal was born. So, I was the first cat around here too, using charts. I would write out charts and be reading charts while I was playing timbales, and nobody was doing that out here. So it was learning experience for me. That's when that picture was taken in the early 70s. Of course, when Orestes moved here in 1980, I hung up the timbales and I didn't play timbales hardly, not too much, very, very rare. After that, I concentrated more on congas because we started, he became the timbalero in all of my projects, and he was the guy. So I learned a great deal from him, but that was my timbal era back then. And in 1976, here's a funny anecdote that goes along with that. In 1976, I was playing in a salsa band called La Banda. I was playing timbales, and the conga drummer was Raul Rico. And Raul came up to me one day. He said, "Hey, man, I got a call to do an audition with Santana." And we're like, "Oh, man, that's incredible." So he went to the audition. He comes back the next day. He said, "Man, they hired me, and they're looking for a timbalero, and I got you an audition." And I'm like, "No, man, no way." So I had an audition with Santana, and they hired me. So this is a bit of trivia that not too many people know, that the first timbalero in Santana, after the original guy, Chepito, who invented that style of rock timbal, well, the first guy after that was me. However, I only lasted in there less than 3 weeks. I was rehearsing and stuff, and it became obvious that I did not have the chops for that gig. I was playing timbales with little tiny skinny sticks a la charanguero style. I had a charanga band that I was playing eventually, and it wasn't the right style. They tried to get me. Carlos told me, no, use these sticks. He had me use Chepito's old sticks, which were like tree trunks. I couldn't even hold them. Well, I didn't have the chops for that. So when it became obvious, they let me go. But in the Santana tree, if you look on there in the book, he has a book out, my name appears in the Santana tree. Although they had a mistake. They put Salsa de Berkeley, which was a local band that I never played with, but they put it as if I had come out of that band, which I had not. However, Raul stayed in that band for 38 years, and I went from that band. I joined a group called Típica Cienfuegos in August of 1976, and I became the director of that band, and that became the first charanga in San Francisco. The first homegrown charanga in San Francisco was that band, the Orquesta Típica Cienfuegos. And then that kind of set my career in motion in terms of digging in deep into the folkloric stuff.
Well, John, there's so much conversation that we can have. And there's a couple of other photographs that I just like for you to just articulate a little bit on. And hopefully we can get back to a little bit of a conversation with the Smithsonian, that you've worked so hard with. Mm-hmm. So let's put up that next picture.
Okay, I'll try to be a little more short on the
okay.
on the comment.
That's a classic there.
Oh man, that picture! I love that picture. That picture is also from the 70s. We used to have a thing here on the 4th of July called the drummers picnic or something like that. I forgot what we called it, but it was a thing where all the drummers in the area would get together and meet in this park. That photo, I'm playing, check it in, and that's Armando Peraza playing conga right there in the front. And I'm like, we're inspired. We're kind of having a conversation with the checkere and the drum. He's playing, he's like the guru because he lived here, for 40 something years. He lived in the Bay Area. So he would come to these things and we'd have a group of us that were playing Cuban stuff. There was a Brazilian group that would come, a Ghanaian group, a Senegalese group. All these groups of drummers would show up and we would all take turns playing and play together. And it was just this drum, orgy that would happen all day long. And that's what that was from. And in that photo, there's a lot of key people to the Bay Area in that photo. That photo has Marcus Gordon, who was who originally was from New York, came here in the 60s. He's the man who introduced the bata drums here in the Bay Area, was Marcus Gordon. He's in that photo. Teddy Strong, one of the great percussionists, Afro-American, was in that photo. Raul Rico was in that photo. I'm looking over here to the side because I have it on the wall over here. Rebecca Mauleon, my comadre, who played piano in many of my early things, is there. Pedro de Jesus, a very respected santero, was there before those days. Everybody's pretty young and just having a ball. You could tell there's a lot of spirit. And you see in Armando's face, he was just like in the zone while he was playing right there.
Wow, fantastic. Let's put one more photo up and then we'll get back to, wonderful conversation.
Oh boy. So that is the great Cachao. And that's my friend Daniel Giray and his son, and Cachao and me. I have a chapter in the book that I'm trying to get to writing will be about Cachao because he's just so important in the history of our music, and I have such a personal story with him. I'll tell you again just the capsulized version, but I have a lot to say about Cachao, which we don't have time to do. But I'll just say that at that time in the 90s, I was, first of all, those recordings that he did in the 50s are like the Bible, especially for us, for percussionists. It really opened up things for the conga, bongo, timbal as solo instruments. Because that record in particular, Descargas en Miniatura from 1957, with Tatahuines and Yeyito, and Barretico, that's the Bible for us, So I was in awe of Cachao and his music. And then René Lopez, I learned a great deal about Cachao from René Lopez, who produced 2 records for Cachao in the mid-70s. And then Cachao, Orestes, who's my padrino, used to play with Cachao in New York in the 60s. So I had a radio show in the late 70s and in the 80s. And I did a show. I wanted to do a show of Cachao's music. And so I did a whole show and I taped it and I told Orestes, I'd like to send Cachao an air check of this show. And he goes, okay, sure, here's his phone number. And Orestes gave me Cachao's phone number. I just called him out of the blue. And he was the most humble, soft-spoken, incredible gentleman, like Gandhi. He was like such an incredible spirit. Wow. And he was so humbled and so thankful and grateful and deferring to me for playing his music on the air. So then I got my nerve up and I asked him, would you be amenable to perhaps coming out here? He was living in Miami at the time and playing in bars and playing bar mitzvahs and parties and weddings. And, he didn't have a band. And I said, would you like to come to San Francisco and maybe be featured as a guest with my band? And he said, sure. So I contacted the SF Jazz Festival and they said, oh yeah. And we ended up in 1989, I produced a show called La Evolución de la Música Afro-Cubana with Cachao, Chocolate Armenteros, Walfredo de los Reyes, Armando Peraza, Orestes, Santana, Machete Ensemble, Kindembo, a big lineup of people to show the history.
Unbelievable. Huh?
We did it at Davies Symphony Hall. It was only the second time that they had Latin music at the Symphony Hall. The first time was the year before when Pablo Milanés from Cuba and Lucecita Benitez from Puerto Rico came, and the band I was playing with at the time called Altamira, we opened the show for them in 1988. So Latin music was new to the Symphony Hall. We sold out the 3,000 seats at the hall, and Cachao came. And then Andy Garcia, the Cuban actor came up from LA, from Hollywood, and met Cachao at our gig, and then he became Cachao's patron, and then he produced all the Grammy award-winning records and took Cachao on tour. But Cachao invited me to be a part of his band. He recorded with me in '89 and '90, so I have the honor of having him on several of my recordings. And then he invited me to play with him. So in the early '90s, I did some touring as the conga drummer in Cachao's band, and we played Paris, the North Sea Jazz Festival. We played in Spain. We played in the East Coast. We played in New York. We played at the Smithsonian, and I just had a great relationship with Cachao. It was really wonderful.
Wow, John, we're almost out of time, but I just want you to use the last bit of time to just speak a little bit on your relationship with the Smithsonian Institute.
Well, it really starts with the folkways stuff that I mentioned when I did in the late '70s and the '80s. I did liner notes for a few of the folkways records, the Cuban danzón, music in Cuba. I did about 3 or 4 records. And then some years later, the Smithsonian acquired Folkways. So Folkways, which had been doing incredible music since the 30s, I think, as early as the 30s, at least till the 40s. They have Cuban music they recorded in the 40s that is part of my resource, my learning. So when they merged, now Smithsonian Folkways was together. I also have a relationship with the Smithsonian because I was part of the committee that put together that project they did called La Combinación Perfecta about Latin jazz, a combination. It was a coffee table book and a CD and I was part of a big group of advisors to that project. So I also played at the Smithsonian several times. I had the honor more recently to play at the opening of the Afro-American Museum that opened in 2016, and we played at the Folklife Festival, and so that connection's been strong. And then our latest record is on Smithsonian Folkways label, the one that came out last year called The Art of the Descarga. So I continue with a great relationship with the Smithsonian.
Well, John, I don't know if you have anything to say, Pablo, to John, but we got to kind of say goodbye to him. We hate to do that, though, right? Because we'd like to get you back, John, at some point.
But that was only like 5 minutes, man. That was a 5-minute interview.
I gotta give you credit on your endurance. You are
I got more pictures. I got more questions. So we're gonna have to do this again, John.
Anytime.
Thank you so much for being on Sabes Que. Did you know, Mr. John Santos, on behalf of Jesse Bermudez and Pablo Bautista? Hasta la próxima.